In today's video, I'm going to break down 4 outdated squat tips that you need to stop doing in 2024. Trying to learn how to squat nowadays is hard enough because there's so many contradictory cues all over social media. And after spending countless hours with people in person, online, and in physical therapy settings, there's just some cues that need to bite the dust this year once and for all. The first outdated squat tip is pushing the hips back during the squat. The theory here is that if we push our hips back and drive more with our hips instead of our knees, we'll have less knee wear and tear, and it'll be better on our knee health overall. In actuality, pushing the hips back during a squat is going to be worse in 2 ways. This study showed that somewhere around 90 degrees is likely the most force on the knee during any part of the movement. So when you push your hips back during a squat, it really doesn't matter anyway, because if you go through a full range of motion, or at least parallel to the floor with your butt, your knees are going to be bent to 90 degrees, thus having the most force of them, which is contradictory to the whole entire cue itself. And you're also going to have a lot more force, not through the knees, but instead through your low back and hips. That's because when you push your hips back, you change the amount of force, and instead of putting more force through the knees, you're actually going to put a lot more force through your glutes and through your low back also. As long as you have good squat technique and you don't push the hips back, it will help you build more leg muscle overall because you're going through a deeper range of motion, and you'll reduce the risk of injury in those little guys. But the main point is, instead of driving the hips back, you actually just want to go up and down during the squat. The squat is intended to be an up and down motion, not some horizontal or diagonal movement here. Think about driving the knees forward as you break at the hips while keeping your feet flat on the floor. But you might say, Tyler, my ankle mobility is restricting me from actually driving my knees forward. Well, a good workaround for that is simply just lifting up your heels. This is going to help you make sure the squat is a little bit more vertical, straight up and down, but also it's going to allow you to have more mobility and get deeper in the range of motion without being limited by your ankle mobility. Outdated squat tip number 2 is pushing the knees out or sliding the feet out. And the theory here is that if you crank your legs out to the side, you're not going to have any knee valgus or basically the knees coming inwards, and you're just going to have a more stable squat overall. But in actuality, this is only going to limit our ability to access internal rotation and limit our movement. Let me explain. When we're descending in the squat, when we reach around 60 to about 110-ish degrees of hip flexion, we need to access more internal rotation to drive force into the floor. This is a chain of motions, but normally it means hip, femoral, and tibial internal rotation, and also pronation of the foot. You might see an exaggerated version of this in powerlifting and weightlifting, which you need to push a lot of weight. But the thing to understand here is that it's not inherently bad to have the knees cave in a little bit. And in my experience, I see a lot more exaggerated knee valgus when we have limited internal rotation abilities at our hip. If they lack the hip internal rotation abilities at their hip, they're still going to have to access internal rotation somewhere down the chain. And normally that means either the knees caving in to find that internal rotation, or maybe the foot collapses to find more internal rotation. And although it's not the most pretty on the eyes, there's actually no correlations between having the knees cave in or having the knee valgus and knee injuries. So unless you're having pain or you have a lot of that knee valgus, there's really nothing to be worried about there. Outdated squat tip number 3 is gripping the floor with your toes. The theory here is similar to the last cue. If we grip our toes on the floor really hard and create a bigger arch, we're going to have more stability, and we're also going to avoid a lot of the knees caving in because our feet are not collapsing, right? We're just in a big arch avoiding that movement. But once again, if we aren't able to access internal rotation somewhere up the chain, whether it's our hips, whether it's our feet, whether it's our knees, we are going to start to compensate at other places to find that internal rotation. When we get around 60 to 110 degrees of hip flexion, we need to be able to internally rotate the foot or pronate the foot to drive more internal rotation up the chain. If you grip your toes and actively supinate the foot, you'll then actively limit your ability to pronate the foot and access internal rotation like we should during part of the squat. So if you're actively working against this, you're going to limit your ability to actually drive force through the floor more than likely. And you're normally going to compensate somewhere, whether that's the knee, the hip, the back. Something is going to compensate regardless if you can't access internal rotation. So instead, what you should focus on is maintaining that tripod foot during the entire motion. The base of the first toe, the base of the fifth toe, and the heel. If you just think about those foot contacts, making sure they're staying on the floor, not actively squeezing your arches, you're going to have a much better time and access internal rotation a lot easier than actively fighting against it. An outdated squat tip number 4 is keeping the chest up. The theory here is that in order to avoid a low back injury, you need to keep the chest up and maintain the arch in the low back to keep your spine healthy. But in actuality, there's a lot of things wrong here. Forcing ourselves into one range of motion all the time is likely going to inhibit our ability to access the other spectrum of that range of motion. And if we have more range of motion limitations, this can actually increase our risk for injury. For some people, this arch in the low back may be fine. You may have no issues with it whatsoever. That's awesome. But for other people, giving a generalized cue as far as chest up is so stupid. So instead of forcing yourself into a position, I recommend doing this instead. Step number 1 is testing your range of motion between an anterior and posterior pelvic tilt in standing. Step number 2 is think about your pelvis as a bowl of water. Spilling the water out the front represents an anterior pelvic tilt. Spilling the water out the back represents a posterior pelvic tilt. Step number 3 is find the point where the bowl is flat, where the water's not spilling out the front or back side, it's neutral. This on paper is gonna be the most ideal position because we're not forced to one side of the spectrum. So if we're neutral and we're kind of in the middle, it's gonna allow us to basically have more wiggle room to both ends of the spectrum. We're not limited to one choice or the other. So when it comes to squatting tips, don't think about 1,000,001 cues that are just gonna confuse you later on. Rather, focus on the things we talked about today. You want to have good foot contact, you want to go up and down during the squat, and you just want to stay consistent with that for a long period of time. And if you like this video, go ahead and check out this one because YouTube's recommending it.